Hello, I'm Mr. Southall. I'm going to be giving you information and notes about the war on terror that occurs in the early 2000s. I'm going to give you a little bit of background information first. There are a lot of different issues that make America and the Middle East not get along, but I'm going to mainly focus on the issues that lead up towards 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11. First of all, the Soviets engaged in a war with the Afghanistan people in 1979. It lasted a decade into the late 80s. This was like their version of Vietnam. They tried to conquer a lot of Afghanistan when were unable to, but kind of like what they did to us in Vietnam, America gave a lot of aid and supplies and support, no soldiers, but support to a lot of Afghan fighters. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of American weapons have ended up in Afghanistan hands in the 1980s. All kinds of machine guns, rocket launchers, all kinds of different devices, ammunition that will be later used against us in the war on terror. But just be aware of that fact that we helped support this war against the Soviets with siding with Afghanistan people in the 1980s. Then you fast forward to 1990, 1991 with the Persian Gulf War. This war took place with America going against Iraq under George H.W. Bush, the older George Bush. So in 1990, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded this little small country of Kuwait, which is right here south of Iraq. You can see all the red lines pointing to it at the bottom. Essentially, they claimed that they wanted to reclaim it. At one point, Kuwait was part of Iraq decades ago, but they mainly wanted it because it had a lot of rich oil reserves there. So without any provocation, they invaded Kuwait. So George H.W. Bush went to the United Nations and formed a coalition. We went into Kuwait and Iraq, pushed those guys out, got them back to Iraq. The key element here is that we won very quickly and very effectively here in Kuwait and Iraq. We pushed the Iraqis back and defeated Saddam Hussein's forces, but we didn't conquer Iraq. We left him in power because that was not our mission. Our mission was not to overthrow this dictator. Even though he was a dictator and he was not good to his people, that was not our mission. We didn't want another Vietnam on our hands, so we left him alone. One important thing to keep in mind is that from that point forward, every year the United Nations was supposed to send in inspectors to make sure that he was not making any kind of biological weapons or any kind of devastating weapons, what's called WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, every year, forever, essentially, to make sure that he was not trying to pose any threat to surrounding neighbors again. But we successfully protected Kuwait. In the 1990s, a lot of Middle Easterners became upset at the fact that America had increased presence, especially after the Persian Gulf War. We maintained a base in Saudi Arabia after this, and other countries in the Middle East as well. Like we still have military bases like in Dubai. So they didn't like the fact that we were westernizing them or helping to influence them, or we're basically in their area controlling and influencing some of their governments and people. They wanted to have their own Middle Eastern, Muslim influence, Arabic culture, and not one of Western culture. So that gave rise to a lot of anti-American feelings. Well, some of that became represented in very extreme versions with terrorist groups. The most famous group to arise in the 1990s was Al-Qaeda, which will be led by Osama bin Laden, which we'll talk more about him a little bit later. So there were two major events of terrorism attacks that they did against us in the 1990s and 2000. The first was the World Trade Center bombing. So before the World Trade Center was bombed on 9/11, there was actually a car bomb that went off that was detonated by Al-Qaeda in 1993 in its basement. So they basically want to do the same thing to the World Trade Center back in 1993 before 2001. So this early group of Al-Qaeda operatives parked a car bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, and blew up the basement and a few of the floors on the bottom floors. It killed several people, injured over 100 people. The building stood, obviously, and they were able to repair it, but it was an early act of terrorism. So they were already trying to go after us in the early 90s. This was happening under Bill Clinton in 1993. There were some other foreign attacks of terrorism that took place throughout the 90s, but the most famous was the one that took place almost a year before 9/11, which was the USS Cole bombing. The USS Cole was a U.S. Navy ship that was off the coast of Yemen on a patrol. There was a fisher boat that pulled up alongside of it and blew up. So it was a suicide bombing mission that blew up a big hole in the hull of the Cole that you can see there. It killed about 20 sailors on board, and it injured several more. But the ship did not sink, and we were able to make repairs. But this was another example of Al-Qaeda terrorism attacking us. So we under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush knew that there's terrorist operatives out there. We're constantly monitoring for this, but we didn't know what they were planning this greater attack that was coming. So look at the war on terror's beginning. So this is going to take place under President George W. Bush, who was president from 2001 to 2009. And of course, we know the major event that triggered the war on terror was 9/11. Shortly after takeoff on the morning of September 11, 2001, teams of hijackers from the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda seized control of 4 American airliners. 2 of the airplanes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. Morning news programs that were filming the moments after the first impact, then assumed to be an accident, captured and aired live footage of the second plane as it barreled into the other tower in a flash of smoke and fire. Less than 2 hours later, the heat from the crash and the explosion of jet fuel caused the upper floors of both buildings to collapse onto the lower floors, reducing both towers to smoldering rubble. The passengers and crew on both planes, as well as 2,606 people in the 2 buildings, all died, including 343 New York City firefighters who rushed in to save the victims shortly after the towers collapsed. The third hijacked plane was flown into the Pentagon building in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., killing everyone on board and 125 people on the ground. The fourth plane, also heading towards Washington, crashed in the field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. When passengers aware of the other attacks attempted to storm the cockpit and disarm the hijackers, everyone on board was killed in this attack. That evening, President Bush promised the nation that those responsible for the attacks would be brought to justice. 3 days later, Congress issued a joint resolution authorizing the president to use all means necessary against the individuals, organizations, and nations involved in the attacks. So kind of like Pearl Harbor, this is an attack on our American soil. We don't have an official declaration of war like what we had with FDR in World War II, but you do see Congress authorize George W. Bush to do whatever he needs necessary to go deal with terrorism. On September 20th, in an address to a joint session of Congress, Bush declared war on terrorism, not an official war, but basically we're going to war with the idea of terrorism and all terrorists. Blamed Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden for the attacks and demanded that the radical Islamic fundamentalist who ruled Afghanistan, called the Taliban, turn bin Laden over or face attack by the United States. This speech encapsulated what became known as the Bush Doctrine, the belief that the United States has the right to protect itself from these terrorist attacks by engaging in preemptive wars or ousting hostile governments in favor of friendly, preferable democratic regimes. So this is kind of like the Pearl Harbor comparison with September 11th. You can see some images there of the attacks on the Pentagon and the attacks on the Twin Towers there. And at the very bottom, you see Osama bin Laden. Before I go into the actual fighting in Afghanistan, let's talk about these anti-terrorist measures back home. The attacks on September 11th awakened many to the reality that the end of the Cold War did not mean an end to the foreign violent threats. Some Americans grew wary of alleged possible enemies in their midst, and hate crimes against Muslim Americans and those thought to be Muslims surged in the aftermath. Fearing that terrorists might strike within the nation's borders again and aware of the chronic lack of cooperation among different federal law enforcement agencies, Bush created the Office of Homeland Security in October 2001. The next year, Congress passed the Homeland Security Act, creating the Department of Homeland Security, which centralized control over a number of different government functions in order to better control threats at home. Some of those include, let me make sure I get my list here, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, Immigration Services, U.S. Coast Guard, FEMA or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, U.S. Secret Service, and Transportation Security Administration, the TSA people who do your security checks at the airport. The Bush administration also pushed the USA Patriot Act through Congress, which enabled law enforcement agencies to monitor citizens' emails and phone conversations without a warrant, thus violating civil liberties. Other arguments, let's see, sorry. The Bush administration was fiercely committed to rooting out threats in the United States wherever they originated. In the weeks after September 11th, the CIA scoured the globe, sweeping up thousands of young Muslim men. Because U.S. law prohibits the use of torture, the CIA transferred some of those prisoners to other nations, a practice known as rendition of or extraordinary rendition, where the local authorities can use methods of interrogation not allowed in the United States. While the CIA operates overseas, the FBI is the chief federal law enforcement agency within the U.S. national borders. Its activities are limited by, among other things, the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. Beginning in 2002, however, Bush administration implemented a wide-range program of warrantless domestic wiretapping known as Terrorist Surveillance Program, headed by the National Security Agency, or the NSA. The shaky constitutional basis for this program was ultimately revealed in 2006. The use of unconstitutional wiretaps to prosecute the war on terrorism was only one way the new threat challenged authorities in the United States. Another problem was deciding what to do with foreign terrorists captured on battlefields in Afghanistan and Iraq. In traditional conflicts where both sides are uniformed combatants, the rules of engagement and the treatment of prisoners of war are clear. But in the new war on terror, extracting intelligence from upcoming attacks became a top priority that superseded human rights and constitutional concerns. So a lot of the people we capture that were suspected terrorists ended up coming to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which we'll talk about that more in a minute. Anyway, so there's a lot of changes that are taking place back home, a lot of threats. We do begin our war on Afghanistan basically in October of 2001. When it became clear the mastermind behind the attack was Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi Arabian national who ran his terror network from Afghanistan, the full attention of the United States turned towards Central Asia and the Taliban. Bin Laden had deep roots in Afghanistan. Like many others from around the Islamic world, he had come to the country to oust the Soviet army, which invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The Taliban refused to turn over bin Laden, and the United States began a bombing campaign in October, allying with Afghan Northern Alliance, a coalition of tribal leaders opposed to the Taliban. U.S. air support was soon augmented by ground troops. By November 2001, the Taliban had been ousted from power in Afghanistan's capital of Kabul, but bin Laden and his followers had already escaped across the Afghan border to mountain sanctuaries in northern Pakistan. So we go to war, and we're actually still at war in Afghanistan even now in 2020. This war has not ended, and this is actually one of the things that currently Donald Trump's trying to do is get us out of this war finally. Even though we don't have a conclusive end or win, we need to go ahead and finish this war. In 2003, we also go to war with Iraq. At the same time that the U.S. military was taking control of Afghanistan, the Bush administration was looking to a new and larger war with the country of Iraq. This is kind of a get back after the Persian Gulf War in 1990-91. Relations between the U.S. and Iraq have been strained ever since the Gulf War a decade earlier. Economic sanctions imposed on Iraq by the U.S., by the United Nations, and American attempts to foster internal revolts against President Saddam Hussein's government had further tainted the relationship. Let's see. A faction within the Bush administration, sometimes labeled the neoconservatives, believed Iraq's government in the represented a dangerous symbol to terrorist groups around the world, recently emboldened by the dramatic successes of al-Qaeda against the United States. Powerful members of this faction, including Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, believed that the time to strike Iraq and solve this festering problem was right, especially after 9/11. The more militant side won out in the Bush administration, and the argument for war was gradually laid for the American people. The immediate impetus for the invasion, it argued, was that the fear that Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction after the Persian Gulf War in the 90s. Hussein had in fact used WMDs against Iranian forces during the war with Iran in the 1980s and against the Kurds in 1988, a time when the United States actively supported the Iraqi dictator. Following the Gulf War, inspectors of the United Nations had located and destroyed stockpiles of Iraqi weapons. Those arguing for a new Iraqi invasion insisted, however, that weapons still existed. President Bush himself told the nation in 2002 that the United States was facing clear evidence of peril, and we cannot wait for final proof, the smoking gun that could come from in the form of a mushroom cloud, meaning like an atomic bomb. The head of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, Inspection Commission dismissed these claims. He argued that while Saddam Hussein was not being entirely forthright and didn't allow for the inspections to go out like they should have, there did not appear to be any WMDs there. Despite these findings and early misgivings, the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, argued in 2003 before the United Nations that Hussein had violated UN resolutions, and on March 17th, the United States cut off relations with Iraq. 2 days later, we went to a fight with a coalition with Britain, Australia, and Poland to take out Saddam Hussein. So we do end up getting into this war in Iraq. We do remove Hussein from power a few months later, but Iraq proves to be a very problematic situation over time. It's a lot of people feel like we were misled about going in Iraq, especially because it becomes apparent that we might have gone there because of oil. Whenever Barack Obama becomes president, he actually withdraws us out of Iraq in 2011. So officially, the war in Iraq ended in 2011. We withdrew, some think too early because it wasn't really stable. So we do put a lot of the people we assume to be terrorists in Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. So these are people who are not Americans, people who we are capturing in the Middle Eastern conflict. We're not going to put them in any kind of American prisons here in the United States because no one wants to take them. So we place them in our naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and we hold them there in these detention cells until we can decide what to do with them. And they're still there today. In fact, President Barack Obama talked about getting rid of these prisons, but was never able to do so while he was president. There were also a lot of controversial interrogation tactics used, like waterboarding, where you would simulate drowning to some of these prisoners to get them to give information. We did this at the detention center in Cuba as well as in the Middle East itself when we captured these people. It was inhumane, but it did lead us to get information. So it's one of those things like, was it worth it? Obviously, the war on terror over time became more and more unpopular. Whenever Bush left, he left with a low approval rating. Obama, as I already said, came in and got us out of Iraq because the war in Iraq seemed to be trumped up on fake information about the WMDs, and it seemed to be more about oil and trying to control oil there. Even though we overthrew Hussein, who was a bad dictator, and installed democracy, we didn't go in there for the right reasons, and Americans died there who shouldn't have died there, essentially. And then in 2014, you see, Osama bin Laden is finally found by the Obama administration in Pakistan. So we have Navy SEAL members go in there and take out Osama bin Laden in 2011. So he's finally killed, but Al-Qaeda still goes on even now. Because some people believe that we got out of Iraq too soon, ISIS forms in 2014. So America re-enters Iraq again under President Obama to take out ISIS. So whenever Donald Trump becomes president in 2017, we're still fighting Afghanistan, we're still fighting Iraq. So very recently, we've basically completely gotten rid of ISIS. We are trying to get out of both Iraq completely and Afghanistan completely with Donald Trump, but it still hasn't 100% happened. So the war on terror has not 100% gone away, but you want to be aware of all these controversial things that we did during this war on terror, like give up a lot of civil liberties back home by letting the government monitor emails and phone conversations. This war has been the longest war in U.S. history. We've been going on for 20 years now. While Iraq is mostly wrapped up, we're still fighting Afghanistan to try to stabilize Afghanistan. We kind of had a coalition help us out. Britain and some of these other countries have helped us out, but we don't have the widespread support you see like in World War II. And not everybody in America is totally supportive of this war. Everybody in America, some people support this war, some people don't support this war. This war is not like a lot like World War II in the sense of a lot of people's lives changed in World War II where they had to give up a ration, whereas in this war, you really don't realize it's still going on. And our casualties for the war on terror have been a lot lower than World War II were. Where World War II, we had over a couple 100,000 Americans die. This war, we've had still only a few thousands of Americans that died in combat here. So that's kind of the war on terror. It's still ongoing. It's hard to kind of wrap up because it's still not really a wrapped up event. But hopefully that helps you out understand this war a lot better.